The story begins in Oakland, California, in the spring of 2001. Sister Abigail Catherine Moore, known to the faithful as Sister Abigail, known to the street as the Woman in Gray, known to the powerful as something they would rather forget, was 43 years old when she stopped praying and started remembering. She had spent 20 years behind convent walls teaching third-grade mathematics at St. Dominic's Academy in a neighborhood where the zip code itself felt like a sentence. She wore the habit without irony, without bitterness, without the theatrical gestures that sometimes masked the vocation of others. She was simply there, present, quiet, witness to the small wounds that accumulate in poor parishes. She was born in Bakersfield to a migrant family that had learned early that asking for justice was how you got noticed, and getting noticed in certain places was how you disappeared. Abigail had chosen the church not as an escape, but as a post from which to observe the world and its cruelties with a certain trained forgiveness. That forgiveness would not survive the spring of 2001. The city of Oakland in those years moved like a wounded animal. The Bay Area economy was contracting. Tech money had not yet reached its second wave. The neighborhoods east of Lake Merritt existed in a different temporal zone than downtown, a place where schools leaked when it rained, where police came late if at all, where hospitals triaged by insurance status, and where certain crimes were filed away with the casual efficiency of someone sorting mail they would never read. The streets smelled of diesel and jasmine and something else that had no name, the particular humidity of human overcrowding, of too many people pressing against too little space. The sounds were precise and layered. You heard children before you saw them. You heard the bass from car systems 2 blocks away. You heard the ambient percussion of a city that never quite stopped moving. Sirens, horns, the metallic scrape of gates being locked and unlocked, the murmur of Spanish and English and Tagalog and Mandarin bleeding into each other like watercolor. The afternoons were hot and white, the kind of California heat that flattens everything and makes time seem irrelevant. Sister Abigail moved through these streets in her gray habit, unremarkable and invisible, as the poor often are to those who would harm them and to those who might help them. She was a fixture. She was furniture. She was background. This invisibility, this particular gift of being overlooked, would become her greatest weapon, though she did not yet know it. The neighborhood began to notice, then to understand, then to speak in the hushed tones of people who have decided that certain crimes need to be acknowledged, but certain justice need not be official. The rumors moved through the streets like water finding cracks. People began to understand that someone in the neighborhood had decided to keep a record, to bear witness in a form that could not be ignored or filed away. The image of Maria Elena's face, abstracted into symbol, became a mark of reckoning. People spray-painted it on walls as an act of defiance. Children drew it on their school books. It became something living, something shared, something that belonged to the community rather than to any individual actor. Derek Castellano eventually left Oakland. He moved to Sacramento, then to Fresno, then to Las Vegas. The image appeared in each city, the spray paint always fresh, always precise, always accompanied by a different Bible verse. His family begged him to report it as harassment, but to do so would be to acknowledge what had happened to Maria Elena, and they had apparently decided that Maria Elena's death was less intolerable than their son's public humiliation. After 6 months, he told people that he was being stalked by a gang. After a year, he stopped denying it entirely and simply disappeared into the criminal infrastructure of Nevada, becoming what the neighborhood had already decided he was: cursed, marked, unredeemable. But Sister Abigail was just beginning. Over the next 3 years, she would identify 4 more men. Each of them had committed a serious crime against a member of the neighborhood that had been swallowed by the system, a rape that had been ruled consensual, a beating that had been ruled gang-related, a theft that had been ruled a civil matter, a death that had been ruled an accident. Each of them had connections to power, to police, to the machinery of institutional protection, and each of them would find themselves at the center of an escalating campaign of symbolic reckoning that did not involve violence in any conventional sense, but which nonetheless dismantled their lives with the precision of a master strategist. The second case involved a juvenile detention center counselor named Robert Yates, who had been sexually abusing boys under his supervision for over 5 years. The abuse was known. The administration knew. The police knew. A report had been filed by a social worker, then lost. A second report had been filed by a boy's mother, then transferred to a lieutenant who had a personal relationship with Yates, and then closed. But Abigail Moore knew. She knew because a former detainee, now working as a custodian at the convent, had broken his silence in confession, and Sister Abigail, faced with the contradictions between her vows of silence and her calling to justice, had made a choice that would have been unthinkable to her a year before. Robert Yates returned to his apartment one afternoon to find that someone had photographed every single person who had accused him, had blown up those photographs to poster size, and had plastered them across the exterior of his building. Beneath each photograph was written a single word: believed. The anonymity of the installation was absolute. It had taken perhaps 3 hours. A neighborhood teenager had later told Abigail that the work had been done quickly, efficiently, by someone who had seemed to know exactly what she was doing. By the time the building management took them down, people had already photographed them, printed them, distributed them. They appeared in a local zine. They were shared on early blogs. They became, in their way, a kind of permanent fixture in the institutional memory of the community. Robert Yates took a leave of absence from his job, claiming stress. Then he announced a transfer to a federal facility in Texas. Then he changed his mind and took early retirement. His house went on the market. His family disintegrated under the weight of public silence, not accusation, not confrontation, but something worse: acknowledgement. The system would eventually investigate him. 3 years after Sister Abigail's intervention, he would plead guilty to a single count of misconduct. He would serve 14 months, but by then, he had already been sentenced by something far older than the law: the verdict of his community, rendered in photographs and a single word: believed. The third case was harder. It involved a police officer named David Chen, who had killed a boy named Marcus Thompson during what was reported as a pursuit of a suspect in a shoplifting case. The boy was 14. The officer was not charged. The investigation, conducted by his own department, concluded that his actions were justified. But Abigail Moore began to trace the patterns, the other cases where Officer Chen's testimony had been crucial, the cases that had been closed quickly, the suspects who had agreed to plea deals rather than risk his word against theirs. She was not alone in her investigation. The community had its own historians, its own record keepers, mothers who had lost sons, lawyers who worked pro bono, activists and organizers, and people who had decided that memory itself was a form of resistance. One morning, Officer Chen arrived at the police precinct to find that his photograph had been enlarged and hung in the waiting area, with the caption, "The faces he has seen." Beneath his photograph were 47 smaller photographs, 47 cases where his testimony had been crucial, 47 faces of people who were now incarcerated or dead. No commentary, no explanation, just the visual fact of accumulated consequence. By the time the police removed the display, hundreds of people had been through the building. Hundreds of people understood what it meant to look into the face of institutional justice and see not blindness but intention. The image was recreated by community members and posted on every social media platform that existed in 2004. It became a template. It became a symbol. It became a form of witness-bearing that could not be unseen. Pause and reflect when justice stops at the gates. Who dares to cross? Officer Chen requested a transfer. He was eventually deployed to a division in a wealthier neighborhood, but he never appeared in public without a kind of hunched awareness, a sense of being perpetually watched and perpetually judged by a court that had no legal authority, but absolute moral power. Years later, in interviews that would never be published, he would admit that the work had broken something in him, not his conscience perhaps, but his sense that his authority was absolute, that his actions existed in a consequence-free zone. The symbol had done what the law could not. But then came Maria Elena's true killer. By 2004, Abigail had never found the evidence that would prove Derek Castellano had murdered her niece. What she had found was something else, the architecture of power that had protected him. And that architecture had a foundation, a cornerstone, a particular man who had decided which cases would be pursued and which would be forgotten. His name was Lieutenant James Morrison, and he had worked homicide for 20 years. His close-outs rate was exceptional. His conviction rate was solid. His career had been steady, professional, and built on a careful calibration of which murders mattered enough to prosecute and which could be safely filed away. Maria Elena's had been filed away because her parents were undocumented, because her neighborhood was poor, because her killer had the right connections, and because Lieutenant Morrison had decided, in the particular way that institutional power decides things, that some deaths were less important than others. Abigail Moore spent 6 months documenting Lieutenant Morrison's casework. She was not trying to prove anything, legally speaking. She was trying to render visible the specific gravity of his choices. She worked with a retired journalist named Rosa, a woman who had spent 40 years covering the communities that mattered to no one else. Together they created something that was not quite journalism and not quite art, a visual archive, a map, a diagram of discretion. It showed every case that Morrison had closed and every case he had left open. It showed the neighborhoods they came from. It showed the race and class and immigration status of the victims. It showed the clear mathematical pattern of his choices. It was not evidence for a trial, but it was evidence of something else, the particular mechanics of how justice fails, rendered in data and images that could be understood by anyone who wanted to see. The archive was printed as a zine and distributed through the neighborhood. It was photographed and shared on early message boards. It reached a law school professor who became interested in police discretion and prosecution patterns. That professor published it, anonymously, in an academic journal. That publication was picked up by a statewide journalists' organization. That recognition led to an investigation by the California Department of Justice. That investigation found, over 18 months, that Lieutenant Morrison had closed more cases per detective than any officer in the state, had secured convictions at a rate that was statistically improbable, and had an unusually high percentage of cases that had been appealed and overturned due to prosecutorial misconduct or withheld evidence. James Morrison did not face criminal charges. The statute of limitations had passed on most of his closed cases, and the cases of actual misconduct were too complicated to prosecute. But he was forced to retire with a reduced pension. He was required to complete a series of trainings on bias and discretion. He was in effect administratively destroyed in a way that was wholly nonviolent and wholly devastating. He lived out his remaining years under a particular kind of social pressure, the understanding that he would never work again in law enforcement, that his competence was now understood to be selective, that his legacy was one of calculated injustice. The system had not been reformed by his removal, but the symbol had been powerful enough to make him want to disappear. By 2005, Sister Abigail Moore had become something that transcended her individual actions. She had become a symbol herself, the woman in gray, the nun with the notebook, the voice of the forgotten. What she had done was not unique. Community activists and organizers and believers in justice had done similar work throughout history, but she had done it with a particular precision, a particular poetic clarity, a particular refusal to be violent, while simultaneously refusing to allow violence to go unwitnessed. She had turned the tools of institutional power, documentation, symbolism, public exposure, against institutional power itself. She had shown that you did not need authority to bear witness, and that bearing witness was its own form of power. But then came the moment when the moral arc bent in a way she had not anticipated. In the course of her investigations, Abigail had discovered information about a particular police officer that was important and incriminating, but also incomplete. She had documented instances of corruption and abuse that formed a pattern, but not a definitive proof. The officer in question had a family. He had a daughter who attended the same parish school as several of the children whose parents had been targeted by his violence. On a Sunday afternoon in March 2005, Abigail attended Mass at St. Dominic's and sat 3 pews behind the officer's family. The little girl, no more than 7, turned around at one point and looked directly at Sister Abigail, and for a moment something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of innocence and complicity, of the way that violence radiates outward and touches people who were not its intended targets. That night, Abigail Moore did something she had not done since Maria Elena's death. She wept. She wept because she understood that she had been moving through the world in a certain kind of trance, guided by a fury that had a purity to it, and that purity had allowed her to avoid something crucial, the understanding that everyone in the system was also a person. The officer was guilty of terrible things. That was true. His daughter was innocent of everything. That was also true. And there was no way to address the guilt of the father that did not on some level reach the daughter. The archive she had helped create, the symbol she had become, the machinery of justice she had set in motion, all of it touched people who had not chosen to be part of it. Pause and reflect when justice stops at the gates. Who dares to cross? Sister Abigail Moore changed her code that night. She would continue her work, she decided, but she would work differently. She would ensure, with absolute certainty, that her actions touched only those who had chosen to abuse power, who had chosen to cover up violence, who had chosen to prioritize institutional protection over human suffering. She would be more careful, more precise, more aware of the collateral weight of her choices. She would continue to bear witness, but she would do so with a fully awakened conscience about what bearing witness meant in a world where everyone was entangled in systems of power, where there was no pure action, where there was only the constant negotiation between justice and compassion, between accountability and forgiveness. That resolution was tested almost immediately. In April 2005, Abigail was approached by a woman whose sister had been killed by a man with institutional connections, whose case had been covered up through a network of favors and silence, and the particular cruelty of the system. The woman wanted Abigail's help. She wanted the same kind of symbolic justice, the same kind of bearing witness, the same kind of public reckoning that Abigail had orchestrated for others. Abigail said no. She said it softly, in the particular way that kind people say no, with recognition and compassion, and the burden of refusal. She did not explain her reasoning. She simply said that she could not do that work anymore, that she had accomplished something, but that continuing would require a cost she was no longer willing to pay. The woman left angry, feeling abandoned, feeling betrayed. Abigail accepted that judgment, without defending herself. She understood that she had been the answer to certain prayers, and would now be the disappointment of others. This was the price of having once engaged in extra-systemic justice. The mere possibility of it would create expectations that she could no longer meet. By 2006, the authorities had begun to suspect Sister Abigail Moore of involvement in various campaigns against corrupt officials. She was never charged. The work was too distributed, too collective, too rooted in community action to be traceable to a single individual. But the police visited the convent twice. The diocese received inquiries. There was a particular kind of pressure, nothing explicit, but understood: step back or face consequences. The Mother Superior, a woman of profound faith and practical wisdom, called Abigail to her office and asked her directly if she had been involved in various symbolic campaigns. Abigail, bound by her vows and her conscience, did not lie. She said only that she had tried to help her community bear witness to injustice, and that she had done so through means that she believed were legal and moral, even if they were unconventional. The Mother Superior looked at her for a long time. Then she said something that Abigail would never forget. The convent is for those who have given up on the world, and for those who are trying to save it. It is the same place for both kinds of people. I cannot protect you if you continue, and I will not stop you if you do, but you must choose what you are. Abigail chose to continue, in a different form. She stepped away from the convent in 2007, citing health reasons for her retirement from teaching. In reality, she was moving into a new phase of her work, less visible, less connected to the institution of the church, more deeply embedded in the community itself. She took a small apartment in the neighborhood, supported herself through part-time work as a tutor, and continued to document, to archive, to bear witness. She was no longer Sister Abigail, though she never stopped living according to the principles that had drawn her to the convent in the first place. She was simply Abigail, a woman in her 50s, unremarkable and invisible, the kind of person that power did not notice because power only looks for threats that announce themselves. If you are watching this story and feeling something stir in your conscience, something that makes you want to understand the systems that fail the people you love, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel. There are more stories like this, stories of ordinary people who have decided that bearing witness is not enough, that documentation is a form of power, that the careful rendering of injustice visible is itself a kind of justice. Subscribe now to receive these untold truths. From 2007 onwards, Abigail's work became less about specific individuals and more about structural patterns. She helped community members document police abuse. She worked with legal advocates to track patterns in prosecution. She trained young people in the neighborhood to observe, to record, to bear witness in ways that were legal and powerful. She created a small archive in her apartment, thousands of pages, photographs, court documents, that served as a kind of counter-memory to the institutional forgetting that had become standard practice. She was not alone in this work. She had become part of a broader ecosystem of accountability that included journalists, lawyers, community organizers, ordinary citizens, who had decided that justice delayed was not justice denied if you could at least refuse to let it be forgotten. But the system she was confronting had evolved, and it adapted to her methods. By 2008, there was a national surveillance expansion happening in urban centers. Police departments were receiving federal funding for cameras, for database systems, for the kind of technological infrastructure that could track, identify, and monitor. The surveillance had of course been marketed as crime prevention, but it was also capable of being turned toward other ends, toward monitoring those who monitored power, toward creating the possibility of counter-surveillance. Abigail Moore found herself in a strange position. She had spent years making the invisible visible, and now she was learning how to use visibility itself as a form of camouflage. The years between 2008 and 2012 were the peak of what some people in Oakland would later call the silent justice movement, though it had no official name and no formal structure. What was happening was that a particular kind of documentation, a particular kind of bearing witness, was spreading through the community like a practice that did not require hierarchy or authorization. Young people were recording police interactions, lawyers were photographing arrest records, community members were creating maps of violence and survival. The technology was becoming democratized in ways that had not been true when Abigail first started her work. What had once required artistic talent and access to resources, the creation of symbols, the production of archives, could now be done by anyone with a phone and an understanding of why it mattered. In 2012, there was a particular case that became emblematic. A young man named Oscar Grant had been killed by a police officer in a BART station in Oakland in 2009. The officer had been tried and convicted of involuntary manslaughter, a rare outcome in police killings, but the sentence was light, and the publicity faded, and the system continued. In 2012, a community filmmaker organized a project where friends and family members of Oscar Grant met with young people from the neighborhood and shared their stories. Those stories were filmed, documented, and archived. Copies were made and distributed. The archive became a record, not just of Oscar Grant's death, but of the particular pain of losing someone to institutional violence, and the particular grace of refusing to let that death be forgotten. Abigail Moore was not publicly credited with the Oscar Grant project. She had learned by then the power of invisible presence, of work that happened in the background, of the kind of contribution that changed everything while seeming to change nothing. She had learned that bearing witness did not require being seen. In many ways, that was its greatest power. By 2014, Sister Abigail Moore had become a kind of legend. People spoke of her in the neighborhood, though no one was entirely certain what she had done, or whether she was a single person, or a symbol for an entire movement. There were rumors. She had spray-painted buildings. She had hacked police databases. She had organized community surveillance teams. She had worked with journalists. She had created documents that brought down officials. She had done nothing but watch and inspire others to act. The truth, as always, was more complicated and less dramatic than any single story. What Abigail Moore had done was help her community understand that they had power, that bearing witness was a form of power, that the careful documentation of injustice was itself a kind of resistance. By 2015, she was largely out of public view. She moved to a different part of California. She continued her work, but in a different form. She was no longer Sister Abigail, and not quite Abigail Moore anymore. She was simply one of thousands of people working in the margins of power, bearing witness, documenting, remembering, refusing to let injustice be forgotten by institutions that preferred forgetting. She had not changed the system. The system was too large, too entrenched, too protected by too much force and money and institutional will. But she had changed something in her community. She had shown that an individual with clarity of purpose and refusal to accept institutional violence could matter. She had shown that bearing witness was not passive, that documentation was a form of action, that symbols could cut deeper than blades. The story does not end with redemption or transformation, because those are narratives that require resolution, and the real world resists resolution. What happened instead was something slower and stranger. The work continued without her, in forms she recognized, and forms she did not, by people she knew, and people she never met. The seeds she planted grew in unexpected ways. The archive she had helped create became something bigger than any individual contribution. The symbol she had embodied became distributed across a community, across a generation, across a movement that she was no longer the public face of. Sister Abigail Moore had one final confrontation with the institution that had formed her. In 2016, the Catholic Diocese of Oakland published a statement acknowledging historical abuse by clergy and committing to greater transparency. The statement was incomplete and inadequate, as such statements usually are, but it represented a particular kind of movement, an admission that secrets were no longer sustainable, that bearing witness had power, that institutional silence was itself a choice with consequences. Abigail Moore was not mentioned in the statement. She received no credit for the work she had helped inspire, but she understood, in the way that spiritual people understand such things, that this was the point. The work had become bigger than any individual. The system was beginning to change, not because of one woman's vision, but because an entire community had decided that it was no longer acceptable to let violence be forgotten. In 2020, when a new wave of protests emerged after George Floyd's murder, many of the young activists in Oakland drew on the particular practice that Abigail Moore had helped pioneer: documentation, bearing witness, the creation of community archives that served as counters to institutional forgetting. They used cameras and phones and social media, but the underlying principle was the same one that Sister Abigail had practiced 15 years earlier: the insistence that injustice be witnessed, recorded, remembered, made impossible to erase through institutional silence.
No one knew where Abigail Moore was by that time. She had become ghost, legend, principal. Some people said she had left California. Some said she was still there, still working, still bearing witness, still helping her community understand that justice did not come from above, but from the collective refusal to accept injustice. Some said she had found peace, that she had finally let go of the weight she had carried since Maria Elena's death. Others said she was still carrying it, that she always would, that this was the price of having awakened to what bearing witness meant. The true answer, like the truth of all such stories, was simpler and more complicated than any single narrative. Sister Abigail Moore had learned that the work of justice was not something that could be finished, resolved, or completed. It was something that had to be taken up by generation after generation, by person after person, by community after community. She had been one voice in an ongoing chorus. She had helped create conditions for other voices to emerge. She had shown that an individual, rooted in faith and community, could matter, could change things, could puncture the veil of institutional forgetting, could make the invisible visible. If this story made you think, made you understand something about how justice really works, about what bearing witness means, about the particular price of awakening to the violence that systems contain, subscribe now. There are more untold truths waiting, more stories of ordinary people who decided that institutional silence was unacceptable, more proof that one person, standing firm in their conviction, can change the trajectory of a community's future. Subscribe to Urban Justice Noir. The truth always burns under city lights, waiting for someone brave enough to see it.